Right, everybody, and we are back today talking about the Carolina Panthers. This will be our second NFC South team that we've covered thus far. And like I did with some of the other teams, I thought it'd be interesting to just give a little bit of background here on their recent playoff history. So, much like the Atlanta Falcons, they had a Super Bowl appearance here in the mid 2010s, although in Carolina's case it was an incredible 15 and 1 feat. Ended up coming up short in Super Bowl 50 to the Denver Broncos in Peyton Manning's final game. But since then, they've missed 6 of the following 7 postseasons, including the last 5 straight. So Carolina is definitely starved for a playoff appearance, to say the least. And I thought it'd just be interesting to note there are only 2 players, just 2, from the Super Bowl 50 roster, that being Shaq Thompson, the linebacker, and J.J. Jansen, their long snapper. So just thought that was interesting to note. So we'll go ahead and look at Carolina's 2022 season here real quick. And of course, they finished with a 7-10 record last year, which was good for second in the NFC South. Actually, very close to the Tampa Bay Bucks, who finished with an 8-9 record in the NFC South last year and ended up snagging the 4th seed as a result. So as we know, Matt Rule was the coach to start the season, and he ended up being fired midway through after a 1-4 record. Steve Wilkes finishing things up with a 6-6 record. Although, as we look ahead to 2023, their head coach will be none other than Frank Reich, the former Philadelphia Eagles offensive coordinator. More recently, the Indianapolis Colts head coach, although he was fired midseason as well last year. So, looking at their schedule last year, how did the Carolina Panthers stack up? Well, we know they went 7-10, wasn't really a very impressive feat, but one thing I did find that was very interesting is you'll notice a lot of these wins were against other teams in the NFC South. So they had a victory here over the New Orleans Saints, again over the Tampa Bay Bucks. They lost that game in overtime against the Atlanta Falcons, one very crazy game that they very easily could have won. A lot of shenanigans at the end of regulation there with DJ Moore. Then they do get the revenge on Atlanta 2 weeks later before sweeping the New Orleans Saints here to finish off the season. So very close to having a 5-1 record in the NFC South, and then they end up losing to the Tampa Bay Bucks here by 1 score. This was the game where the Tom Brady to Mike Evans connection finally came alive just in the nick of time to save the Buccaneers season, because Tampa Bay loses that game. We could have been talking about Carolina winning the NFC South last year, as crazy as that was. So crazy as that would have been, I guess I should say. So other points of interest from the 2022 Carolina Panthers season. Of course, you will notice that Christian McCaffrey is listed on here for 6 games. He was traded to the San Francisco 49ers right before the deadline, and they turned around and used some of those draft picks as ammunition to move up and select Bryce Young first overall in the 2023 draft. Trade will look a little bit more in depth here in a second, but we'll just finish up with the Carolina Panthers in 2023. 2022, excuse me, really isn't too much to note with this team. A lot of just very middle of the pack stats just for the team across the board here. Looking at where are they at here? Their offense, really nothing impressive, but nothing egregious. Same with their defense. One thing I did find was interesting was the Carolina Panthers finished 5th in 4th down conversions last year. Granted, they didn't take a ton of 4th down attempts. Like, they didn't go for it on 4th down a ton of times, only 21 times, but that was right around the middle of the league. So the fact that they had a 57.1% success rate on that, pretty impressive for a team that ended up with a losing record and missing the playoffs. So just thought that was interesting to note. And then they did end up having Brian Burns as their only Pro Bowl player here, ended up with 12.5 sacks. They did also have technically Christian McCaffrey, though, like we mentioned, he was traded at the deadline to the San Francisco 49ers. So more so attribute him being a Pro Bowler for representing San Francisco. So now let's look ahead at what the Carolina Panthers did in the offseason, because I find this very interesting as well. They really, and this is just showing basically on the left-hand column here, 2022, what team did the guy play for, and then on the right, what team is he projected to play for. So you'll notice a lot of these guys still left unsigned out in the NFL free agent world, awaiting their next employment opportunity. But you will notice, though, that there really aren't a lot of notable players from the I'm sorry, not the San Francisco 49ers, from the Carolina Panthers, rather, that are no longer with the team. So you have Miles Hartsfield, who really is probably the only player here above 50% in terms of this is snaps played for the team in 2022. What percent of snaps did this player play for their team last year? He's really the only player here above 50% from the Carolina Panthers last year. We also have one more hiding down here, Corey Littleton, but really not too many notable losses for the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, DJ Moore is included here as well, although, as noted here, he was traded, that being in the very large package to move up from 9th overall to 1st overall with the Chicago Bears. He was the only player involved in that trade. The only other assets in that trade were draft picks, which we will look at a little bit more in depth as we move along here. But if you're the Carolina Panthers, I think that's a no-brainer. You take that trade 10 times out of 10. And the Carolina Panthers are able to replace DJ Moore here in free agency. They added quite a few players in free agency. Notably at the wide receiver position, they add not only Adam Thielen from the Minnesota Vikings, but they also added DJ Chark from the Detroit Lions. So definitely encouraging. Give Bryce Young two weapons. Yes, you lose DJ Moore, and that's going to sting. When we talk about Chicago, definitely going to factor that in. He's going to, I'm sure, have a fine season with them as well. But if you're the Carolina Panthers, this is a team that really needs to, I mean, they don't need to do a full-scale rebuild. I'd say they're definitely emerging from a rebuild, if you even want to call it that, because a lot of the core, I feel, is sort of in place already. There are some players who are definitely going to be sticking around here, although they did need to move on from some big names like Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore. Just a necessary evil to be able to get their franchise quarterback, which DJ Moore being included in the trade himself, and then the assets they acquired for Christian McCaffrey definitely played a part in that. But it doesn't stop there. The Carolina Panthers do add some other notable players in free agency here. They signed Miles Sanders, running back from the Philadelphia Eagles last year. Played 57.1% of their snaps. He figures to be their starting running back. We'll break down the depth chart in just a second here. They also bring in Hayden Hurst, tight end from the Cincinnati Bengals, as well as Von Bell, starting safety for the Cincinnati Bengals. So we discussed how Jesse Bates, the other safety for the Cincinnati Bengals, signed with the Atlanta Falcons. So Von Bell also heading to the NFC South, this time to the Carolina Panthers. And then just some other notable players that they add in free agency. I'll throw out a couple players from the New Orleans Saints here. Like I mentioned in the Atlanta video, these NFC South teams really love to just shuffle their players around to each other. So they bring in Shy Tuttle, defensive lineman from the New Orleans Saints, give him $6.5 million this year over 2 years for 13 total, and Andy Dalton, 2-year deal worth $8 million, $5 million this year. And I think Andy Dalton, that was definitely a savvy pickup. He's been around the block now in the NFL for quite a bit of time. Of course, a starter for the Cincinnati Bengals for many, many years. I believe it was 9, if we want to be exact, before they decided to turn the page and draft Joe Burrow first overall in 2020. Although since then, he's really he's found a role for himself in the NFL, I would say, as a journeyman quarterback. He's really been able to establish himself as a backup, as a mentor for some younger players, while also being able to step in and produce if called upon. I think this is a perfect fit for him going to the Carolina Panthers. Really makes absolute sense on both sides why the Carolina Panthers would want to bring him in and why Andy Dalton would want to come in here, back up Bryce Young. So moving along, we'll look at the Panthers 2023 draft, and really not too much to note here. Obviously, they trade up to the first overall pick to select the big fish and Bryce Young, but beyond that, they only have 4 other picks the rest of the draft. Second round, they take Jonathan Mingo, the receiver from Ole Miss. He'll definitely figure to play a key cog in their offense this year. They actually kind of have some sneaky receiver depth, which we'll look at in a second. Then they grab DJ Johnson, edge from Oregon in the third round, followed by Chandler Zalava, hope I'm pronouncing that right, guard from North Carolina in the fourth round, before finally taking Jamie Robinson, safety from Florida State in the fifth round. So that's really all there was to the Panthers 2023 draft, although when we look back, much like when we look back in the 2023 draft as a whole, it'll be remembered for Bryce Young. This is where they get their franchise guy, and if he turns out to be the answer at quarterback, definitely very encouraging for them. So now let's segue right into the Panthers 2023 depth chart. Now, we will take this with a grain of salt, of course, because the preseason is just getting underway. A lot of this is in flux. The Carolina Panthers actually did put out their first team depth chart on their website today, which I will cross-reference here. Not really too much of a difference from the other depth chart on Our Lads, but I will make a couple references back to this as we move forward here, because there are a couple key differences. There are some position battles ongoing that we'll break down here. But do like how Our Lads sets up their depth chart page, because it shows how the players were acquired by the team in addition to what role they're going to play on the depth chart this year. So as we mentioned, Bryce Young's going to be their starting quarterback as a rookie with Andy Dalton backing him up. Bryce Young will probably be at least one of three quarterbacks starting as a rookie this year, along with CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson. We'll see if anybody else ends up joining them. Doesn't look like Will Levis is going to be starting in Tennessee, though who knows? Injuries always are a possibility in the NFL, or Ryan Tannehill just has a bad camp, although I'd be very surprised if Will Levis starts out at the gate. So, moving on to the running back position, Miles Sanders, who they signed from Philadelphia, figures to be the starter. Chuba Hubbard holding down that second role that he held very nicely behind Christian McCaffrey for the last season and a half before taking over as the starter for the remainder of the 2022 season. Maybe a little bit light on depth here, but you know what? Carolina is a team that doesn't really have many expectations this year. They're a team that's definitely looking to just have their quarterback establish himself within the offense, build some camaraderie with his teammates, and you know what? If we can just have something close to what the results they had last year, if they're finishing around 7-10 again this year, I think that's a win in Carolina's book, because then they're going to really try to build off of that going forward. And I do believe that if all goes well, by the end of this season, we could be talking about Bryce Young as the best quarterback in the NFC South, and I really don't think that would be too much of a surprise. Look at the competition that's out there. We already discussed the situation in Atlanta with Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. Not really overly enthusiastic about either of those players. Then there's a competition going on in Tampa Bay right now between Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask. Baker Mayfield's reportedly having a tough camp down there, so be interested to see how he does this year. Definitely talk about that more when we get to Tampa Bay. And then New Orleans is probably the front runner for having the best quarterback in the division right now, signing Derek Carr to that huge contract. But you know what? If Frank Reich's able to build a good offensive system here, and Bryce Young's able to utilize the weapons that Carolina's acquired this offseason, he could very well end up finishing this season as the best quarterback in the NFC South. And if we're looking at just pure statistics from the 2023 season, wouldn't be surprised at all if he ends up as the strongest quarterback when all's said and done, though it is his rookie year. So, like I said, it really wouldn't be too much of a slight against him if he has not an ideal season this season. If the Panthers don't have an ideal season this year, they're kind of just playing with house money right now. Looking at the tight end position next, they do have Hayden Hurst slated to be the starter, although there is a bit of a competition going on for that second spot with Ian Thomas and Tommy Tremble. Be interested to keep an eye on that. Tommy Tremble's a younger player. Ian Thomas is a bit of a veteran, but if one of these guys could build some rapport with Bryce Young, could definitely benefit him. Tight ends are always a great safety blanket for any quarterback, particularly young quarterbacks. Also why the Hayden Hurst signing was definitely a smart move. He definitely had some nice chemistry with Joe Burrow last year, especially in the playoffs against the Buffalo Bills. Now we could look at their offensive line here. This isn't really particularly one of the better units in the NFL, but I won't really say it's one of the worst ones either. They're pretty firmly middle of the pack, I would say. This is probably about as average of an offensive line unit as you'll see. So they have, oh geez, should really know how to pronounce this name. I'll say Akeem Ek- I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. I'm sorry to the young man, only in his second year out of the NFL here, but he's going to be their starting left tackle. They really haven't had too many any much deliberation about him. You invest a first round pick in a left tackle, you figure he's going to be there for the long haul. Then they do have Taylor Matone here at the right tackle position. I do believe they just extended him relatively recently, so I definitely have faith in his abilities over there. That left guard, Brady Christensen, third round pick from 2021. He's definitely figured to be a key cog in this offensive line. Bradley Bozeman at center, and then the only real competition going on here right now is at the right guard position. So, as noted, Austin Corbett, who is slated to be the starter, is on the physically unable to perform list, and he did suffer a torn ACL, I believe, in December of last year. So right now there is a competition going on between several players here. Chandler Zalava is involved in that. Michael Jordan, no relation to the basketball player from North Carolina, he's also in the mix. We also have, where's he at here? I'm not even seeing him on here, but okay. Then the front runner though for the position is going to be Cade Mays. It's the gentleman I was looking for. Cade Mays is the front runner for this starting right guard position. So the reports coming out of Panthers camp right now are that Cade Mays is indeed on the fast track to secure that starting right guard spot, at least while Austin Corbett recovers. So definitely be interested to keep an eye on that, especially since there's so many names involved here. Competition always brings out the best. I'm sure as the preseason progresses, we'll find some more answers with that. But all in all, not a bad offensive line unit. And when you have competition like that, that's a good thing because you know that you'll be able to rely on Chandler Zalava and Michael Jordan to potentially step in if things go south on the interior of the offensive line this year or if injuries occur. Could go hand in hand. Rounding out the offense here, we'll look at the wide receiver position. So two big names we mentioned already coming in, DJ Chark and Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen figures to start at the slot receiver position, with DJ Chark starting on the outside, though there is a bit of a competition going on as well with Jonathan Mingo trying to secure one of these three spots. They do still have Terrence Marshall Jr. slated to start at receiver, which we could cross-reference this with the Panthers' unofficial depth chart that they released already, which they have DJ Chark, Adam Thielen, and Jonathan Mingo as their three receivers. So they technically have Terrence Marshall Jr. listed as a reserve here, so definitely interesting to note that. And of course, you could see here they have Cade Mays listed as the starter for the time being. So then moving along to the Carolina Panthers defense. Now this is another, Carolina as a whole, they really are just a very middle of the pack team right now. Really isn't anything here that's standing out to me. Nothing that's really jumping out at me, but there's also nothing really egregious either. So we do have a few competitions going on here as well. One of the more notable ones is probably at the outside linebacker position between, where is he at here? For this, yeah, this left outside linebacker position between Yetur Gross Matos as well as the veteran Justin Houston, who, if we look at the Panthers depth chart they released today, is slated to be the starter right now, although that is definitely up in flux. Justin Houston, of course, longtime NFL veteran, most notably with the Kansas City Chiefs in the early to mid 2010s. At one point was definitely considered one of the best linebackers in all of football, but definitely a steady presence that Carolina will be very grateful to have on the roster this year. And another player in the mix here is Marquise Haynes Sr., so he's figuring to be in competition for this spot as well, although I will note Their only Pro Bowler here, Brian Burns, is in a contract year. We'll look at Carolina's contract situation in a second as well, but he is reportedly in need of a new contract. So if things turn south with that situation, Marquise Haynes Sr. could seize the day and potentially take that role if Brian Burns isn't showing up and doesn't report to the Panthers by the time the season opens. But the Panthers do have some cap flexibility, so I have confidence that'll work themselves out. But even if Brian Burns does decide to play out this season and potentially ends up on a different team next season, maybe that could be an opportunity for Marquise Hayes to step in there. So now looking at the secondary, we have a couple guys here who were injured last year. Dante Jackson and J.C. Horn, both of their starting corners. J.C. Horn, of course, high first-round draft pick in the 2021 draft. And there is a competition going on for that third cornerback slot behind them, not including Jeremy Chin. He's kind of out on doing his own thing here as the nickel cornerback. He, of course, was a second-round pick in 2020 and definitely burst onto the scene, having a tremendous rookie season, although has tapered off a little bit since then. They did bring in Eric Rowe to be a reserve for that nickel corner role. But I will note the competition going on for the cornerback spots behind J.C. Horn and Dante Jackson. So some of the names in the mix right now, the frontrunner is definitely C.J. Henderson, a former top 10 pick as well of the Jacksonville Jaguars the year before J.C. Horn. He was drafted in the 2020 NFL draft. And some of the guys giving him competition are going to be Stanley Thomas Oliver III. We have Keith Taylor Sr., as well as Greg Maben, all competing for that third cornerback slot. Although, from what reports are coming out of Panthers camp, C.J. Henderson does have the inside track for that job. Then at the safety position, they have Von Bell, who, after they paid him, is certainly going to be a starter for them, paired alongside with most likely Xavier Woods, although they did acquire some depth in the draft this year with Jamie Robinson. All in all, not a bad unit at all. Then we will look at, I'm referring to the secondary, I suppose I should say. The defense as a whole, like I said, is definitely middle of the pack, but a lot of potential in this secondary, I will say for sure. Looking at the defensive line real quick, of course, probably the biggest piece to the puzzle here is Derek Brown, their first-round pick from the 2020 draft, actually selected just a couple spots before C.J. Henderson. He hasn't quite lived up to the hype of being a top 10 pick, especially in a draft with as much talent as the 2020 NFL draft, but he's been a fine player for them. Definitely been somebody they could depend on the defensive line. Then they go out and acquire Shy Tuttle, as we mentioned, from the New Orleans Saints. And then they also have Deshaun Williams as their starter on Our Lads. We can compare that to the Panthers' other depth chart here that they put out today. And they actually have Marquand McCall slated to start here. So they have him listed as the backup nose tackle on Our Lads, but he's the starting nose tackle here because they have Shy Tuttle listed as a defensive end. Carolina is switching to a 4-3 this year, so that's definitely a logical conclusion to make. Alright, so that just about does it for the Carolina Panthers depth chart. We'll say we also have Johnny Hecker down here as the punter. Definitely one of the better ones in the NFL. Give him a shout out. Many years with the Los Angeles Rams. Always seems to pin other teams deep and give them a long field to work with. So for a team with a rookie quarterback, that's definitely a nice fail-safe to have. Alright, so looking at Carolina's schedule for 2023. Now, I had them projected to finish with a 6-11 record as the 10th seed in the NFC. Although, it is interesting to note because I do have them splitting with the Tampa Bay Bucks, but hypothetically, if this scenario does come to fruition and we get to this final week, Carolina is able to win this game, that would actually propel them to the 4th seed, where they would win the NFC South and host a playoff game against the Dallas Cowboys. So if Bryce Young, Frank Reich, and company are able to pull that off this year, this season would be an absolute win. Do believe this NFC South is wide open like we discussed with Atlanta. I think any one of these 4 teams could honestly win this division. Carolina against Atlanta week 1. and then against the New Orleans Saints week 2. So we'll definitely have some answers right off the bat as to who has the inside track in this division. I don't think Carolina's schedule is anything overly difficult either. Going from those 2 divisional games, they get Seattle and Minnesota and Detroit. Oh, geez. So this 4-game stretch before the bye week is a little bit tough, rather. But if they are able to pick off one of those games, even though I have them projected to lose all 4 of them, they still end up with the 6-11 record. So they could pick off one of those 4 games. They could definitely find themselves in a very pleasant spot by the end of the season. Then they get to their week 7 bye, and coming out of that, they play 2 of the other rookie quarterbacks, CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans at home, followed by Anthony Richardson and the Indianapolis Colts at home. So I think both of those games are absolutely winnable. Then they go on the road to Chicago on a Thursday night, which honestly, they could definitely win that game as well. That'll be the DJ Moore revenge game, if you will. But Carolina Panthers are more than capable of winning all 3 of these games, in my opinion. Although they do face this tough stretch up here. Not the end of the world, though, because moving along, they do get a bit of another tough 3-game stretch here with Dallas, Tennessee, and Tampa Bay. 2 of those games on the road, but none of them really too far away, all staying in that same southern region for the most part. But Dallas should be able to take out Carolina. That would definitely be a massive upset if the Panthers pulled that out, but I have Carolina beating Tennessee and Tampa Bay here. So I do believe if they have some early season struggles, which with a rookie quarterback I think is entirely possible. I'm not going to sit here and say they're going to beat Seattle, Minnesota, 2 teams that made the playoffs in the NFC last year, or Detroit, a team that figures to make the NFC playoffs this year. Then Miami, a team who did make the AFC playoffs last year and is hoping to get back in again this year. Definitely a tall task for the Carolina Panthers, but maybe they don't go 0-4. If they could go 1-3, I think that would even be seen as a moral victory for them. But as we get in later in the season here, Bryce Young starts learning this offense a little bit more. I could see an upset or 2 here, if you want to call it that, over Tennessee and then down here over Tampa Bay. I think that's absolutely possible. And then looking at the New Orleans Saints again here in Week 14, I do have them beating the Saints in Week 2, but they swept the New Orleans Saints last year. It's entirely possible they do the same thing again this year. Then much like with the first 2 weeks of the season, they get the Saints and the Falcons in back-to-back matchups. So wouldn't be surprised if the Panthers split these games or they even go 2-0. These will definitely be a critical, I guess I'd call it a critical 3-game stretch here, all in the division once again. Tampa Bay, New Orleans, and Atlanta in consecutive weeks. Then finishing out the season, they are at home against the Green Bay Packers, which this honestly could be a pretty entertaining game because I think Carolina and Green Bay will probably be around the same spot in the NFC playoff picture by the time we get to this point. And whoever wins this game could very well go on to give themselves a shot, at least to make the NFC playoffs. I don't have Green Bay or Carolina making the playoffs here, although it's entirely possible that either of these teams could sneak in if they win this Week 16 matchup. Week 17, yeah, Jacksonville's probably the better team. Big brother Doug going up against Frank Reich, Trevor Lawrence, the big brother #1 overall pick, going up against Bryce Young. Carolina, honestly, if they play their cards right, they could probably be in not too dissimilar situation as Jacksonville in about 2 years' time if they continue to build this thing up. Fun little matchup there of the 2 expansion teams in '95. And then to round out the season, they get Tampa Bay once again, which, despite all of this, despite them losing to Jacksonville, losing to Green Bay down the stretch, losing to New Orleans down the stretch, losing 4 consecutive games here in the early going of the season, they could win this game against Tampa Bay and find themselves atop the division. So who knows? I really don't see any of these 4 teams running away with the division. I will still stand by Tampa Bay winning the NFC South for now, although, like we said in the Atlanta video, I was very impressed, at least more than I thought I was going to be, with the Atlanta roster after we went through it with a fine-tooth comb. And I'm honestly probably not as impressed with Carolina's roster, but I do like their quarterback situation much better, and I like their head coaching situation a lot for sure. So that's definitely a great place to start, and definitely wouldn't count out the Carolina Panthers potentially making some noise in this NFC South. I will say, if we're talking big picture over the next couple seasons, I think this could be Carolina's division going forward. I think they could definitely find themselves in the driver's seat, much like Jacksonville has found themselves in the driver's seat in the AFC South. Jacksonville is honestly a pretty nice blueprint for Carolina to build towards. Funny enough that they're playing each other week 17 with potentially playoffs on the line for both of these franchises. So, looking at the bigger picture moving on, we can look at Carolina's salary cap, because why not? We've done it with the other teams, we'll do it here as well. Carolina really doesn't have too much tied up in the cap this year. They still have a little bit of cap space here, probably about 20 million or so, maybe even a little bit more. So definitely have some flexibility going into the season, but they are a rebuilding team. They are a team, I guess I should say, emerging from a rebuild. They have their franchise quarterback in place on a cheap contract for the next 5 years. So if they're able to get some cap flexibility in 2024, 2025, they could really build this thing into a contender. They have some pieces in place for sure to build around. Now, they do have Miles Sanders signed to a 4-year deal, but really not for that much money. So if he's able to produce for them even a fraction of what he did with the Eagles last year, you take that. You take the production. It's good for Bryce Young to have a running back he could depend on in the backfield. And with Chuba Hubbard could be a threat in the passing game as well. So he's only signed for just over $1 million for the next 2 seasons. If you're the Carolina Panthers, you take that every time. Moving along, they really don't have too much invested in wide receiver either, despite the fact that they brought in DJ Chark and Adam Thielen this offseason. The two of them are combining for just north of $5 million this year. So look at some of the receivers that are getting paid a ton of money this year, like Jacoby Myers making north of $10 million with the Las Vegas Raiders, and staying with the Vegas Raiders, Hunter Renfrow is making more than Christian McCaffrey, as we discussed in my video on the running back position. So Panthers are getting some good value from the receiving spot here with these two guys. And then they have Jonathan Mingo and Terrence Marshall on their rookie deals combining for just over $3 million. So when all's said and done, your top 4 receivers are combining for under $9 million with a quarterback on a rookie deal, a running back committee that really isn't having much money committed to it at all. This gives the Panthers a lot of flexibility going forward, and it really puts them in a position where if they do want to start investing heavily in, say, a wide receiver down the line, if a big name becomes available and they want to make a move for him, or even same thing with one of these running backs. We've seen so much drama at the running back position. Hypothetically, if a guy like Jonathan Taylor becomes available, the Indianapolis Colts don't want to have him paired with Anthony Richardson to help him as a rookie. I mean, send him to Carolina. Pair him with Bryce Young. That would be a great piece for him to be able to learn with, but that's just spitballing. Moving along to tight end position. Don't really have too much money committed here either, although Hayden Hurst is due for a raise in 2024, just with how the cap hit is structured. Not the end of the world, though. Panthers do still give themselves some flexibility. Then on the offensive line, Taylor Matone, $13 million a season. Looks like he's getting a big fat extension here for 2 seasons in 2024 and 2025, but not a bad thing. You're going to want Bryce Young to have his protection, so you can live with that. But beyond that, really not too much invested in the offensive line. Their left tackle is still on his rookie deal here with potential option for 2026. And Austin Corbett, the injured right guard, still under contract for this year and next year before his contract voids out. Although, who knows, maybe if Cade Mays is able to step up and produce in that role this year. Word is he's been working like crazy at camp and he's really been putting the time in. So if he's able to step up, maybe you can move on from Austin Corbett entirely and give yourself $10 million more in cap space next year. Then you have Bradley Bozeman, your center. He's going to get a raise after this year by about $5 million, signed for another 2 seasons. But again, nothing over the top. Still gives you some good flexibility, gives your young quarterback some protection. Absolutely love to see it. And really not too much else committed at the offensive line here. Your only other starter here, Brady Christensen. signed for not even $2 million for the next 2 seasons. So definitely love to see that. So for the most part, Carolina really doesn't have a lot of money committed to their offense. Looking at the defense now, Brian Burns, as we mentioned earlier, he's on his fifth-year option, slated to become a free agent after this year. He is in search of a contract extension. I'm sure Derek Brown will be looking for one after next season as well. He's going to be getting his fully guaranteed extension option in 2024. Then moving along, Shy Tuttle just signed from the New Orleans Saints. His cap hit will see a slight bump in 2024 up to about $8 million, but really not much else doing on the defensive line here. Looking at the linebacker position now, Shaq Thompson actually going to see his salary cap decrease by over $7 million next season. So, hey, there's some money you could give to Brian Burns. Why not? Give you some stability on the defensive side of the ball. Wouldn't really like to see him walk after this season. Feel like he's definitely a part of what Carolina's been building. I mean, other than that, a couple guys on a one-year flyer. Well, Frankie Louvu has been here, only signed through this season, but Camu Grugier-Hill is on a one-year deal, just over $1 million. So probably want to re-sign Louvu here, but like I said, ton of cap flexibility still. Then DJ Johnson signed for still another 4 seasons, so definitely love to see that. Looking at the secondary now, Dante Jackson signed for just this season and next season with void years after that, so maybe they'll try to bring in another cornerback in the draft next year, or maybe they'll want to re-sign CJ Henderson if he really proves to step up. Need to see Dante Jackson come back and make a healthy recovery, I feel like, before you can extend him beyond 2024. Then you also have J.C. Horn, who could potentially have a fifth-year option for 2025. I think if he has a nice bounce-back season, he's healthy, and is able to establish himself as the number one corner, that's a no-brainer. You pick this up. Then Xavier Woods signed for the next 2 seasons. He's getting up there in age now, so they might let him walk in 2025. Jeremy Chin is in a contract year, potentially need to pay him, although he hasn't had quite the production he had when he first came into the league, so quite possible they bring him back at a discounted rate, if at all. I think I would like to see them bring him back. Feel like it would just be one of those players that it'd be better to have him than to not, especially if you have the cap space to do it. He's still very young. Wouldn't really like to see him leave for nothing. And Von Bell, who they just brought in, he'll be due for a bump in cap hit next year, but still, to have a leader on that defense, that's definitely worth it. And that's really it in terms of the cap hits. So Carolina finds themselves in a very flexible position in terms of the salary cap going forward. Always the case when you have a quarterback on a rookie deal like this. So very intrigued by Carolina's situation going forward. While I don't think this is their year per se to win the NFC South, I think they'll definitely be in the mix. And at the very least, I think from 2024 and beyond, they should be in the driver's seat in this NFC South division. And speaking of 2024, we could pull up their draft picks here. Of course, they traded their first round pick next year to be able to move up and acquire Bryce Young, and they also gave up their second round pick in 2025. So if you're looking at this from a front office point of view, unlike a team like Arizona, who seems very much committed to the idea of trying to be near the top of the draft this year, the Panthers don't even have their own first round pick. So they really have no incentive to perform poorly this year, which for a quarterback in his rookie year, head coach in his first year, they really are just playing with house money. This year is going to be a season all about just trying to establish a new culture, establish the new offensive and defensive system. Honestly, they're switching to the 3-4. You want to make sure that guys are buying in to both the culture and the system in place. You want to see Bryce Young, really, more importantly than anybody else, take some steps this season, find some chemistry with his offensive line, his weapons around him, with the coaching staff. You want to see the defense really gel and mesh into their new roles, and just look for a season that you could really build on going forward. Because I do believe if Carolina does have another season like last year where they're 7-10, that's going to be their floor. That's what they're going to be building off of going into 2024, where they could potentially look to win the NFC South next year. And then beyond that, playoffs should be the expectation for them, really just looking at the outlook of this division. Although if Atlanta does find themselves a franchise quarterback, they could certainly be in this conversation as well. So that's all I really have on the Carolina Panthers. I'd be interested to know what anybody's thoughts are out there on the outlook for this team. Do you think they can win the NFC South in 2023? Do you think they're going to be a cellar dweller? I think they're going to be right around where they were last year, and this is probably a season they could absolutely build on. So let me know your thoughts down below. That's all I got for you guys. Look forward to the next one.